work I'm going to present is it's really part developed together with the colleague Marco Nathan, who teaches at the University of Denver. And today, however, I'll give it a spin that is not exactly what we did in a paper that is forthcoming. But the bulk of the structure of the analysis is from a joint work with Marco. So let me start just by saying a very few words about oppression. It's a much more complicated topic, of course. So we can think of oppression as some sort of unjustified, that's really important, structural constraints over people, who hold some sort of limited power resources to overcome, these constraints. Okay, and the tools that are used to carry forward these structural constraints can be multifarious, and it's really something that we can focus on. And of course, we've been discussing access to institutions such as educational institutions, government office, or certain roles within corporations, laws, values, practices, but also I'm going to mention this later, for instance, the design of built environment, which is a topic that hasn't been maybe as much discussed by philosophers and that I'm quite interested in. What are the effects of oppression? Typically we think of them in terms of unequal life chances, and in this sense, oppression can be seen really as related to the so-called biopolitics and also the so-called necropolitics, okay, and unequal social outcomes. Some key facts about fat oppression. Okay, so in one important factor is often cited to show the level of oppression about fat people in our societies, in many societies around the world, is that obesity in some countries, for example, by the American Medical Association, has been regarded as a form of disease, and as a disease that is responsible for an epidemic, or you could even conceive it as a slow pandemic, right? Something that really slowly creeps into a certain health system. But we can also cite the fact that there are prominent fitness culture that focus on weight loss as a value in itself. So they don't focus just on body image, on obesity, or on certain health conditions. They focus just on weight loss as a value in itself. Often, the literature cites also films and TV shows that use fat-phobic humor, or they use a negative portrayal. Think of the famous or infamous TV show like The Biggest Loser, that portrays in a certain way people who try to lose weight. There is also important legal discrimination. So as of now, there is basically almost, as far as I know, nowhere a specific legal tool against fat discrimination. Okay? And people who are fat tend to have statistically less trust in a courtroom. We have evidence about this, and we also have statistical evidence that they're more often found guilty than people who are not regarded as fat. And there is also, of course, pervasive interpersonal discrimination. Okay, so this is maybe more specifically titled to the title of the talk, social norms. I'm going to address, in a way, I'm going not to take specifically just social discrimination in a sense, but also something a bit broader as a focus. The National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, for example, also claimed in the US that size discrimination equals racial discrimination. And depends, of course, maybe how you collect the data and so on and so forth, but certainly, when we talk about fat oppression, we're talking about a phenomenon that is really pervasive in society. So modeling fat oppression is not that easy because, of course, we're trying to model something that is invisible to some extent, right? So we're perpetrating something that pervades our everyday life, often as I mentioned before already, our design structure. So the ways in which we design, for example, the built environment, and in many social norms, they are implicit. Those who are oppressed are also used to typically receive the blame for this discrimination and for the mistreatment. So we're talking about, again, a phenomenon that is quite complicated to make more explicit. The core idea that I wanted to discuss here, this is a really broad issue and topic. What I wanted to discuss is something relatively specific, which is how can we model, some of these invisible structural features, or to what extent we can do that in terms of a notion that was developed in metaphysics, philosophy of science, in general, the debate on causation, which is called redundant causation. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is that if we look at redundant causation, we could have some way to model effect oppression that could be interesting. Okay, so to talk about that, I need to say something about causes and causal chain. Okay, so this is very basic. Call a direct cause. An event, when you have an event C that causes an event E, if and only if C is the last act of a causal chain that results in direct effect. Okay? Sometimes this has been conceived in terms of the fact that between the cause and the effect, there is a certain quantity that is preserved, that is transmitted, or that you can think of this in terms of existential dependence. I'm not going to be concerned with some of those details that may be important eventually, but not to sketch out the idea. So you have a simple causal chain when you have a temporally and spatially structured plurality of events that end with a direct cause. Okay. That's the standard case. Now you have redundant causes when you have some sort of redundant causal chain. So you have a plurality of events whose structure seems to weaken the influence of the direct cause. Okay. So we can call it the redundant cause, the presumed direct cause, and then the redunding cause, the potential direct cause. Okay. And in the literature, we have now come to distinguish varieties of redundant causes. Like I'm going to introduce some of them now: overdetermination, preemption, diffusion, concentration, aggregation, and so on and so forth. Some of perhaps the early work, is not the earliest work on redundant causation, dates back to about 20 years ago from the late David Lewis, and then has continued ever since. So what is part of the account I'm going to defend here is that the prevailing approach to redundant causation says that redundant causes are a problem in a sense for a theory of causation, and they do not exercise a causal influence over the effect, really. But they're part of the structure of explanation. Okay? So for instance, Michael Strevens, in a book about 12 years ago, and in some other context has defended, he's not the only one, this type of view. So the view is that if we wanted to explain what is going on, we include also redundant causation into the picture. But if we have to claim what is it that actually causes a certain effect, we take the redundant cause and not the redundant causes. Okay, so basically we take whatever is the event that actually ends up causing the effect, and not everything else that stays around it. Okay. So this type of approach concentrated, I think, on special cases of redundant causation. And the core idea here is to instead, in a way, reverse the picture. Okay, so to think of redundant causation as the standard view, as the standard model, and to think of simple causation as just precisely a simpler version of some forms of redundant causation, and think that redundant causation is really good for modeling social phenomena such as effect oppression or effect shaming. Okay. So the idea again is that all sorts of redundant causes are part of the causal model. Okay. So and the evidence we think we have for this is that a causal model that keeps together cases that are apparently very different, can actually be provided to suggest that it's best if we think of redundant causation as the standard picture of causation. Okay. So let me just go over some very basic examples. So imagine that you have a causal chain that ends with a group of events, again, each of which is sufficient to cause a given effect. So you have, for instance, 5 physical impediments, like the chairs, they are not good, the entrance door, the bathroom access, too many steps or complicated steps, and this moving space that you have within a cafe, in a coffee place. And each of those would suffice in itself to impede a person to get, to the coffee place and buy a coffee and take a coffee. Okay? So you think that that person is not going to the coffee place, is not going to get the coffee because there are all sorts of impediments that would prevent that person from doing so, right? So if the person couldn't pass through the door, but if they could pass through the door, they couldn't move through the space. And if they could move through the space, maybe if they need to use the bathroom, they couldn't get to the bathroom, and so on and so forth. If they want to sit down, they couldn't sit down. And so you can think that each of those by itself would suffice to prevent this person from going to get a coffee. But so the idea is that all of them, they overdetermine like the effect. Okay, so this is just a picture for now. We're going to come back then to this, right? And the problem in general in the literature is if we take a standard view of causation, which one of those is the direct cause of the effect? If all of the impediments, they seem to contribute in equal measure, to the effect, right? Or they can contribute equally, right, to the effect happening. A different kind of causes is what are called the preempted and preempted causes. So we have here a causal chain that ends with a direct cause that anticipates, so preempts, a group of other potential direct causes. Okay, so here you can think that in order to get to the coffee place, the person had to take the town bus, right? But the town bus is designed in such a way that the entrance door and the seats are inaccessible to them, while the standing area is too narrow. So you get the same effect that the person doesn't get to take the coffee, but doesn't get to take the coffee in this case because there are 3 preempting causes, in a sense, right? That the person can't get on the town bus, and you can't get on the town bus because of 3 joint overdetermined causes, right? That determine why this person cannot get on the bus. Okay? So you start here building a picture, which is a standard picture actually for a lot of people that might have body sizes that are unusual for the people that design spaces, that suggest that again we have a whole set of structural causes that preempt the person from getting to another place and overdetermine in each place, being the bus or being the coffee shop, to carry forward certain actions, certain tasks. And you can add to this, to this model, you can think of how, prejudice could be part of also something that we think in terms of redundant causes or overdetermined causes. So think of, a community of, say, 3,000 people where obesity is stigmatized, and Alpha is one of the few obese community members. Alpha wants to sign up for the Summer Bridge tournament, but to do so needs a team partner. And Alpha's friend Gamma and Altri gossip about Alpha in town, so that when Alpha calls his friend Beta seeking for a team member, Beta declines the invitation, right? And you could think that Beta may be the only one bearing responsibility because Alpha calls Beta, Beta says no, and Alpha gets disappointed with that and doesn't call anyone else, or and so that's the end of the story. But on the other hand, you may also see that if Alpha would have called Gamma instead of Beta, Gamma would have had exactly the same reply, right? So you can think again that there was here a structure of overdetermining causes, such that if Beta wasn't the one applying the prejudice against Alpha, Gamma would have done that, right? Was ready to do exactly the same move. It's just that Beta was the one that happened to do it in this case. Okay, so we have here a case of prejudice, which is, you can think of it in some sense as some sort of disposition, right, of a person to act in a certain way, right? And you can think of it precisely in some sort of causal terms. So in the ways in which we often think of redundant causes, we see them as, we can call them Cambridge causes. You know, Cambridge in the sense that as the expression is used sometimes in the philosophical quarters, these causes, they just sit there, they don't do anything, right? Their only causal role is that they have a link with real causes, right? So the fact that the seats don't fit well a certain person, you could think just sits there. Maybe in the end, the person doesn't take the coffee because the entrance door was not large enough, was not adequate for the size of the person, or there were too many steps. And so the seat ends up being a Cambridge cause. It's something that could be a cause, but it just sits there. So it's part again of the structural explanation, but it's not part of what causes the person not to do something. Right? So only redundant causes is the idea they actually do something, and that the actual contribution to an effect is what we contend is not that all that there is to a cause. The idea is that I think potential contributions should be included inside the picture as well. Okay. So how can we model this? You know, this is basically the little contribution, I think, of this type of work. Let's think of a collection of scenarios. You can call them words. It doesn't matter. Let's not make metaphysical assumptions for now about that. You know, it's just you have an actual scenario, an actual word, and then all sorts of other words. You can think that in each context, besides the actual scenario, you can have all of the relevant arrangements of causes that could capture all the possible turnouts, right, of what the person does, of agency. Right? So then you assign a value to each agent for any scenario, right? And these values are based on two functions. One is captures the potential influence over the effect, okay, of a certain agent, where an agent could even be a thing here, like it could be the chair, it could be the door, it could be. So, and this value is going to be between 0 and 1. Okay? And then you have a function, call it I, which is the influence, right, on the direct cause. Okay, so on whatever eventually ends up, seems to end up being the reason, you know, as we say, the direct cause of the person, the agent not doing, you know, certain things, or the cause of the effect. Okay, so the value, this value is going to be between -1 and 0. Okay, so redundant causation is of EX is you have it when the sum of the values of EX for any agent involved in the scenario is more than 1. And then you have a redundant causation in terms of influence when the influence of the redundant causes, you know, the direct cause, that's the one that is, that's the measure that we have over the influence. Okay. Let me try to exemplify this. That might be, I think, slightly clearer. So we have, say, in the actual world, in the actual situation, the coffee place. The coffee is designed in such a way that there are 5 distinct agents, in the sense like design elements, that that redundantly prevent the person from getting a coffee. Right? So one of them is A, B, C, D, E. Okay, so each of them by itself would suffice for the person not to get a coffee. So in this way, we can calculate that the cause is overdetermined 5 times. Right? So the design of the coffee shop overdetermined 5 times that the person is not going to get a coffee. At the same time, you can think, or this is one way of, you can conceptualize it, but maybe it's not the only way. You can think that each of the 5 elements equally influences the turnout. So the fact that the person doesn't end up getting a coffee at that coffee place. Okay? So what that means is that each of the elements, contributes for an influence that that we measure as negative 0.2. That once you add them all up, you can see that you can measure the actual contribution of the reason that is selected to be the one that of the contribution, sorry, of each of the agents. Right? So take if A is the door, the entrance door, the idea is that the steps, the seats, the moving space, the bathroom access are all influential redundant causes that contribute to the fact that the person doesn't end up going to the coffee place, right? So you can calculate that the actual influence of the door is 0.2 over the result, the outcome. Okay. So this is in this modeling scenario, I'm just assuming that each of the elements, of the design elements, contribute equally to the reason why the person doesn't get to the coffee place. Of course, you may have very different intuitions. You can think that the steps are much more important, or the entrance door is more important, the bathroom access maybe is not equally important. So if you want to do that, then what you do is just you change the values of the influence causes. Like you'd have to, the I's for each of the agents, they have to be distributed differently. And perhaps you could even think that some of the causes are not really one, in terms of the E function, they could be 0.5, or some of them could even count for 2. So you could think that the calculation of the E function could be different, right? And maybe it could end up being 4.5 or 5.5, depending on how you assign the values to each of the elements. But the basic idea, if I hope it's somewhat clear, is that when you think of the coffee place and the design of the coffee place, you can think of that space as over-determining the effect that the person doesn't end up going to that coffee place, and you can think of this over-determination in 2 ways, right? In terms of how over-determined that is, and in terms of how each of these elements influences the element that is then in a narrative that we tell actually regarded as the direct cause of the effect. Okay, so suppose you ask the person tells you, well, I didn't end up going to the coffee place because the steps are too many. You think, well, also there will be a lot of other elements there. So if I want to measure the form of oppression that there is in the coffee place, I could take as a direct cause the steps, because that's the thing that the person maybe bumps into, or that really sticks to their memory or to their mind. But at the same time, you know that there will be a lot of other potential causes there, right, that are redunding the effect and actually end up having an influence over that. If you think of the scenario that involved the town bus, what you do is that basically you'd add into this picture, if you want to model it this way, you'd add into the picture the fact that in the bus, if you remember, there were 3 elements that would constitute some form of redundant causes, right? The door entrance, the seats, and the standing area. And so you could think that this adds even more to the structure of overdetermination, right? And you could think, for instance, that in this case, but I'm just, maybe the entrance door is so crucial in this way that, that call it A, in this scenario. So the entrance door of the bus is the one that takes all sorts of responsibility for everything happening, and you want to assign 0 to the eyes of all the other elements in the picture. But this is something that you'd have to figure how to how to model, if you want to model it in this way, or if you want to model it in a different way. If you think of the case of prejudice, again, you can think that the total is that if alpha would have not been mistreated by beta, gamma would have done the same, right? So you can think that beta is not the only one who's responsible for alpha not going to play the soccer game. Gamma is also responsible. And perhaps you can, we were saying there were many more people perhaps involved in this in town. They were gossiping about alpha, or they would have done exactly the same thing, and that were all friends of alpha. So you could distribute, again, the I function over them in a bit more. And perhaps, well, in this scenario, the way we built it is that the example, the way I told it is that beta seems to be the only direct cause over alpha not playing. So in the E function, beta seems to be the only one bearing a full number, 1. But you could also build it in some different way. You could maybe tell the scenario in such a way that other elements contributed all at the same time, to so overdetermine the outcome. In this case, well, if we're just measuring the prejudice, what we can think of is the influence function. Okay, so in the prejudice, we can think that not only the person who's eventually bringing about the delivering the prejudice, but also all the other people that contribute to influence it, even in a general way, for example, to create some structural conditions, have some sort of influence. Okay. So what is the idea? Again, the basic idea is to think that if we give to all the agents within the picture a certain if we assign to them a certain value for which is lower than 0 on the I function, or if we assign to the E function a value higher than 1, what would happen is that we are representing the causal structure as bearing a certain amount of redundancy. Okay, and this amount of redundancy you can think is a common condition when we think of causation, right? Most of the causal scenarios that we find, especially of the social causal scenarios, are scenarios that deal with forms of redundant causation, and the scenarios that deal with just simple causations are very, very few. And so when we are thinking about fat oppression, what we can think of is that most people who move through spaces, who live in societies where there is fat oppression, they experience in most social contexts a very high degree of redundant causation for a certain effect, right? The effect of not being the one holding a certain social position, the effect of being the one who's being told off, being the one who may be distrusted or misunderstood. And so there are all sorts of prejudices that could play in that picture, or all sorts of other outcomes that might not just be about having a prejudice, that are overdetermined with respect to that person in that context. And if we would want to measure this, one way could be precisely to think of a model where the structure of causation recognizes a certain value in terms of the E value, the E function, or a certain value in terms of the I function, so the influence over what is the actual turnout, that is, as indicated, significant. Okay. So
yeah,
this is
just quickly, we're 31 minutes in.
yeah.
So
No, it's the last slide is perfect.
yeah, cool.
So some open question the one could have is, okay, here there are only two functions, and you might already have all sorts of questions because we have been met with about these just two functions that were presented. Why, just calculating the E function and in this way, and why just having the influence function that way? Maybe we could also add some other kinds of functions. And I think, by all means, perhaps I'll be curious to see if you'd like to add additional functions, especially in cases of like fat oppression. And we could also try to think what is the relationship between the structure of causation and the responsibility. This is a big question, that is lurking in this area. So the people that have an I function of like minus 0.2, so gamma, that had somewhat of an influence over beta in turning down alpha, should gamma be responsible, for the turnout or not, to what extent, and to what extent we do it now. And you can think also of how you could incorporate, of course, this into a broader model of social change, including social change with respect to fat oppression. So I'll just stop here and take questions. The paper that I'm mentioning is this one that I'm using, is this one by Borghini and Nathan, 2022. Thank you.
Excellent. What a fantastic talk. Thank you, Andrea. So now we can give you a round of virtual applause, and we move on to questions.